My name is Father Mark Stelzer. I'm a priest of the Diocese of Springfield in Massachusetts, and I'm also the Director of Education for Guest House, which is a residential treatment center located in Lake Orion, Michigan. Many of you might be familiar with Guest House. Guest House serves exclusively Roman Catholic clergy and religious, also seminarians. And in addition to being the Director of Education for Guest House, I'm also a very proud alumnus of Guest House and was treated there back in 1999. And that was the beginning of my own journey in recovery from alcoholism. And I'm very delighted to accept the invitation of CMSM to offer just a few thoughts on recovery, addiction,
during the COVID crisis, and with some particular application to those who might be involved in 12-step programs, but I think with enough of a general broad base that there might be some appeal to all of us who are living through these challenging times. So I'd like to share a screen with you here that I do have of a brief presentation. But I'd like to entitle this little presentation, this brief presentation with a few slides, which will last between 10 and 50 minutes altogether, is a saying that's familiar to all of us who might be in 12-step programs. And that expression is what it is to stay on the beam, to keep our eye on the prize, to sort of stay focused during these unusual times. And how do we stay on the beam, not only those of us in recovery from chemical or other addictions or involved in any other sort of wellness program? How do we stay particularly on that beam in light of the COVID crisis and the new challenges that all of us are facing? Go into the slide playing mode and advance it here. And for those of you who are actively engaged in 12-step recovery, these are just a few of the citations of that favorite expression of Bill Wilson, the founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, who stated several times in the 12 and 12, which was a reflection on the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, written several years after the big book was written, that we want to be reasonably certain as we go throughout our lives, not only in good times but in bad times, that we are on this AA beam, that we remain spiritually fit. And he goes on to note later in the 12 and 12 that there are times in all of our life, and I think personally speaking right now, this might be a time as we live through this pandemic where all of us can seem to be a bit temporarily off of that beam, a little bit off focus, finding it a little bit more difficult to stay on target, to stay in the day, and that's certainly understandable. And he noticed even later in the 12 and 12 that without ever necessarily returning to whatever addictive process we might have been engaged in the past, we often can get quite far off the beam nonetheless. And this becomes particularly relevant, I think, for clergy and religious who might be living very successful lives in recovery as we consider remotely the possibility of relapse during these challenging times, that before we even pick up the first drink or enter into the addictive process again, it might be we might need to focus on those times and those moments when we sense that we are off that beam. So just a few comments based on my own experiences. As I indicated, I work remotely for Guest House and have the great privilege of working in seminaries, working with religious communities, working with our clients in treatment, working with church leadership in the United States and beyond, offering all sorts of presentations. But I'm also full-time in a parish in Holyoke, Massachusetts, an inner city parish. I'm also actively engaged on the faculty of our diocesan college, and my own experience last week, our recent experience of Holy Week, was a poignant reminder that I certainly was longing for that old normal, even as we live now with this new normal that has been part of our lives for the past several weeks. And I'm sure many of you, as we went through the Triduum, just long to have people in our churches, to see those familiar faces that I know it was personally painful for me to go into the church on those days, the quiet church, a church that seats 1,200, which on Easter would literally be filled, not only the main church, but 3 balconies as well. And to see that place empty and feeling a deep sadness that resonates, I think, with all of us engaged in ministry in a very real way. We're also longing for the old normal as we realize the projections coming out in the media each day, which suggests to us that our churches, our Catholic schools, our colleges may not open in the near future, that this predicted May opening may not be a reality. And this creates a certain angst for all of us who are clergy or religious, but special worries, I think, for those of us who are engaged in administration or leadership, and not just the financial hardship that we will be suffering and knowing, but we begin to ask ourselves questions. What will the future look like? What will we be able to sustain realistically when things do open again, and when our lives return to that normal pattern we knew? And also, as we look at living with the new normal and long for the old normal, I think we have to be especially conscious of leadership and their increasing concern about the well-being of their members. I'm very fortunate to enjoy a wonderful relationship with the Sisters of St. Joseph, the Sisters of Notre Dame, who were not only my teachers, but are now my colleagues in ministry. And members of their leadership team have expressed this constant worry for the well-being of its members, especially the elderly and others who might be living with chronic illnesses, who are especially vulnerable to contracting COVID, in particular those who might be in community-sponsored retirement homes. And as Bishop Leo O'Neill, the former auxiliary bishop of Springfield and later the ordinary in Manchester, New Hampshire, often said of religious life in general, that our poverty, the poverty of religious in particular, is the poverty of an unknown future, that we just don't know what tomorrow will be like. And this is not to sit where we become so fixated on the future that we can't live in the present, but I think all of us have some realization that when we speak of returning to the old normal, that old normal after COVID will never really exist for us, that there will be need for some reconfiguration, some rethinking ministries, and that creates what Leo O'Neill so often referred to as the poverty of uncertainty concerning our futures. So more than ever, this becomes a time of self-care, and we realize, as we've heard so often and can say so readily to others, but I think in my case certainly find it hard to internalize for myself, that the self-care that we're called to these days is never a selfish act. It's simply being a good steward of the only gift I have, and that's the gift of myself, my ministry, and that gift that I believe each of us was put on earth to offer to others. Emily Scott is a minister in one of the mainline Protestant churches, and she recently published an essay which was entitled Tips for Spiritual Leaders During COVID. And this will be in the resource list that CMSS will make available to all of you after the presentation. And she made a statement which is, sounds tongue-in-cheek, but I think it hits to the reality that none of us during this time really are thinking probably as clearly as we would in normal circumstances. And that's certainly understandable. There's a lot weighing on all of our minds, and not just on the minds of leadership. That familiar patterns of life and living that we've been familiar with for so long, familiar patterns of ministry are just no longer there these days. So she also asks us to realize the fact that it's important to assess the big picture, what's happening in the news, as she suggests, just once a day. I personally made a decision about 2 weeks ago not to listen to the news 3 or 4 times a day, to listen to the news once a day, and to rely upon an app, a mobile app from the state of Massachusetts, which gives the COVID warnings, restrictions, and statistics for that day. We certainly can't put our heads in the sand and make believe that COVID is not happening, but to constantly be dwelling on the news, as certainly I was the first few days, just has a very negative effect, at least in my opinion. That this becomes a time for all of us as priests and religious to pause with the extra time that COVID does give us to sort of assess our vocation, where we are, and the particular gifts that each of us have, and how they can meet the needs of our time. The things that we can do for parishioners, the things that we can do, in my case, for students I am teaching, without physical contact, to remain in touch and to continue that ministry. Little things that we do perhaps in new ways or old ways that we are just restoring, to stay in touch and to exercise ministries. She uses the expression I like quite a bit, that we need to take time to savor all the good that is happening as we begin to see new forms of community happening, even as we live in isolation, as we reach out to care for and to support one another, perhaps with greater sensitivity than we have in a long time. And a very good friend of mine who was in the seminary, he left before ordination. He now works as director of mission for a Catholic healthcare system. Obviously, they're wearing masks throughout the day, and he published a post the other day who said that even through the masks, we can see people's eyes, and that with their eyes, people are still able to smile. And it's this type of connection, I think, that is beginning to emerge as we begin, even despite everything going on around us, to sense that there is a lot of good there. That this is actually a time when we can appreciate the fact of what it is to do less and not feel guilty about it. That this is a time that I certainly am taking for myself, with all of my courses going online, without having to celebrate public masses, without having a lot of the parish meetings that normally would be there. That maybe this is just God's invitation to me, I'm telling myself, to actually do less and to think about things that normally I would not think about. Emily Scott also suggested that this is a time to adapt and to pivot, that we have to be sort of agile, to realize that we learn more and more about the crisis and what our response has to be to it. And we realize more and more the need to change our everyday patterns and routines in parishes and schools and colleges, that we have to be open to this ability to adapt and to pivot and to move with the situation as it evolves. And it's so important to practice rituals of prayer and structures of self-care that we might have had in place and need to reinforce, or to even establish new rituals of prayer and structures of self-care as this crisis continues. And also to remember that we're not God, that we are only one person with limited gifts, that God ultimately, the higher powers we refer to in 12-step programs, is ultimately looking over us with love and tender compassion during this time. When we speak about wellness during this time, I think it becomes very important that part of our self-care becomes self-triage, and that at least once or twice during the day, we take time to ask ourselves just how well I'm doing physically, how well I'm doing on the psychological domain. Am I depressed? Am I becoming anxious? These sort of chuck-ins with ourselves. Even in this time of social isolation, distancing, am I able to experience some connection with people in a new way? And also spiritual. How am I doing on that domain? Do I feel connected to something beyond myself? Do I feel connected to God in prayer? Can I find strength in praying not only for myself, but in praying for others? And these four domains are the domains we look at all the time in addiction treatment and recovery, saying that addiction manifests itself on each of these four domains. Recovery is about showing improvements in each of these four domains. And I think these are life lessons that can be applied from the recovery circle to the current crisis we are in. Just how well am I feeling physically? How am I doing emotionally? How am I doing relationally? How am I doing spiritually during this time? And to be able to ask in appropriate ways for the help that I do need. This whole phenomenon of social distancing, I think for those of us in recovery in particular, but certainly for all of us in ministry, it's presenting a very new challenge. After all, for all of us, our entire life, our entire ministry has been about social interaction. And therefore, this new reality of distancing can be particularly challenging. And I think we need to remember that for older clergy and religious in our communities who don't have access to social media, that social distancing can be particularly painful. One of the older sisters with whom I taught is now a resident in a long-term care facility. Obviously, people cannot visit her. The most she can visit with people is by FaceTime, and because of dementia and other issues there, that becomes increasingly difficult for her to recognize the people there. And her caregivers, the staff, keep saying that this particular sister is experiencing a sense that she's being abandoned at this time, that the familiar faces who visited her this week are no longer there, and she cannot make that connection between the crises and why she's not having these visitors. So I think we need to be especially conscious during this time of the impact of the crisis on the older members of our communities. And for this reason, I think the importance of old-time communication tools such as phone calls, handwritten letters or cards become especially important, that they help us remain in contact with others and assure them that, they are not far from our thoughts and far from our prayer. And on a positive note, sort of the light in the midst of darkness, the many healthy practices that all of us are developing, including myself during this time of isolation, I think are forging a type of new commons as people experience living life together but alone, a sort of a paradox that is part of this new reality that is the world in which we are living and continuing to exercise ministry in a very different way. So again, Guest House is a treatment center which deals primarily with chemical addiction and process addiction. Once again, we treat only clergy and religious and seminarians. And at the heart of our treatment is an abstinence-based, 12-step-based program of recovery. And at the heart of all of the 12-step programs, which I believe even people not in recovery can learn from, especially at a time like this, is the concept of we. That I cannot do any of these recovery tasks alone. That I cannot go through this current crisis alone. That I need the support of other people. And in the case of 12-step recovery, frequent contact with others is key to the success of all 12-step recovery. And it's for this reason that this current pandemic can be particularly challenging for those of us who are in recovering communities, such as Alcoholics Anonymous or any of the other 12-step fellowships. And so what we've seen happening, at least in my world here in Massachusetts, is the emergence of outside meetings where people are meeting in parks in groups of 10 once a week. There are some meetings, other meetings are held daily in certain times. Regular meetings that might have met in a church are now meeting outside of the church, in parking lots, or perhaps on church grounds, or parks that belong to the city. Just to have an outside meeting so that contact with others can be maintained. There is the emergence of online meetings. Certainly in my own life, my world has become Zoom or GoToMeeting. The entire college has switched to online teaching, as most colleges in the country have, and I spend more time on those media platforms now than ever before. And the wonderful thing is that 12-step groups have adapted to these online meetings. I had the opportunity just this past Sunday to speak at an online meeting to a group that normally meets in Manhattan every single Sunday. So this is providing support. And these online meetings, FaceTime, whatever it might be, can be a way for members of the religious communities to stay in contact with each other. During this time of the crisis, there's been a strengthening of recovery networks, groups of people that every one of us in recovery hold particularly close. In my case, it's a group of 5 or 6 men whom I go out of my way now more than ever to be in contact with on a daily basis. And a lot of that done is through the old-time ways of communication, through phone calls, through text messaging, newer ways of communicating, through FaceTime. More than ever, we are realizing as the regular meetings cannot be held, that we need to stay to each other, that, again, to go back to the basic principles of recovery, that I can't do this alone, but we can. So what are some of the insights that might be gained as we look at the COVID crisis from 12 steps, 12-step recovery, the 12 steps first laid out in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, which was written sometime around the year 1939. That as we walk through this, and again, these steps I believe apply not only to people in recovery, but to all people who are trying to live a more meaningful, richer life during this crisis, that we have to begin with that admission that we are powerless over the current situation. It does not mean that we are impotent or that we are not in charge of our own lives or anything like that, but we're really powerless over the way this epidemic, this pandemic is going to go, that we are not in control. And so therefore, there is a need, in a very healthy sense, of surrender to that reality, which leads us to the second step of 12-step recovery, that we believe that there is a power greater than ourselves, which can restore us to health, that there is a God actively at work in our lives, even in these difficult moments. Then the third step is not only intellectually knowing or believing on a spiritual level in this power who is in charge of the world and its universe and all that happens within it, just to make that decision to let go and to let God. Not totally in a passive way, but in the healthy way of a surrender where we're able to say that I don't need to figure this out all on my own, that I can turn my will and my life over to the care of God, who is watching over the universe, watching over each of us, even in these trying times. Then we skip to the maintenance steps of the program, the last 3 steps, that we continue to take personal inventory, as we said a couple of times throughout the day, and just ask myself, what's going on in my life? What's right and what's wrong? That personal check-in, that self-triage. The 11th step tells us that we must continue through prayer and meditation to prove our conscious contact with God, perhaps now more than ever, to maintain those recovery practices, which are so important. And then the last step is that having had a spiritual awakening as a result of our spiritual practice, these steps, that we try to carry the message to others. And what's the message we try to carry? This message of hope and strength, even in the midst of the darkness that does surround us, that we are called to share hope, particularly with those who are part of our religious communities. And there is, again, a list which will be provided separately of resources to you. These are a couple which are not on that list, which I think are valuable. The first is a valuable link to intervention, that we realize that as we go through this crisis, there may be people living with signs of addiction even before we entered into COVID. And as a result of the complexities of our world now, that need for help, that need for treatment may become even more manifest. And this is a resource, Get Help, Give Help, which was put together by the J's, Deborah J, particularly in consultation with Guest House, and provides an online platform to walk leadership in particular or friends through the steps of intervention. Should we see that somebody is having a problem with some sort of addiction or some sort of behavior during this time that we are experiencing. And also there is a hotline which is very helpful, not only during COVID, but at any time where there is 24/7 help available, constant help available to people who might be experiencing particular distress and may not feel comfortable going directly to a religious superior or somebody else in the community. And this is provided by, it's a government resource, and again, with clinicians who do respond to calls on a 24/7 basis. And just to conclude this presentation without trying to sound like Pollyanna, we have to realize that at times like this, we rely upon an awful lot of the slogans that are part of 12-step recovery. Again, which I think to apply to all of us, that this situation will pass. I do think that the world will be different, and I pray in many ways that it will be a kinder and gentler world and church after this. But the current situation of social isolation, of being estranged from the people that are close to us in ministry, that all of this one day will pass, and we pray that it will pass soon. And in the meantime, we just have to stress the importance of doing those things that we can do, some of them suggested here in this very brief presentation, to take care of ourselves and to stay on the beam, to stay focused on what truly matters during this time of crisis for our world and our church. So I'm going to come out of the slideshow to thank you all for allowing me this opportunity to share with you. I hope that some of the resources provided will be valued to you or to others in your community.